for today's session, and then introduce briefly our speakers today. So as a reminder, today you can earn up to 6 NAB, NCAP, NTCRC, and or NCCDP CEUs. To earn the credits, you need to attend the 4 sessions, and you need to fill in the CU surveys no longer than midnight on Friday, June 25th, so that we can process your certificate of attendance and issue these CUs for you. Please note that due to the high number of attendees, certificates will be sent out via email throughout the week of June 28th and no later than Friday, June 2nd by the end of the day. We upgraded our system very recently, so if you have any questions, please reach out to webinars with an S at linkedsenior.com. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and it is currently viewable on both Facebook Live and Zoom. Now, in order for you to get your credit, please log into the Zoom session. Also, the chat and the Q&A features are enabled. The Q&A is where we'll pick up the questions that we'll ask to our panelists and speakers. And as a reminder, if you are looking to chat with everyone, which is a very engaged crowd today, please select on the Zoom setting both panelists and attendees. And for the people that are playing our virtual bingo game, the bingo word for this session is rule. So with that, Dr. Seltzer, if you don't mind taking us to the next session, I'd love to, I'm actually quite impatient to introduce both of you as you're going to be leading our 4th session of the day. And it's your, yeah. And so, you're good? Yeah. Our session today, our 4th session today is Elevating the Senior Living Experience, Culture Change for Resident Engagement. And I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Stelter, who is our product program director here at Link Senior, and joined by Dr. Katie Abbott, Associate Professor of Gerontology at Miami University Scripps Gerontology Center in the beautiful state of Ohio. Dr. Stelter, Dr. Abbott, thank you for joining us. I'll let you take it over.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to stop sharing for 1 second because I would like to put this in slideshow view, and I can't do it with the Zoom thing. So just give me 1 second, and then I am going to reshare here. There we go. We are ready. Thank you so much, Charles. We really appreciate it. And Katie and I are both very excited to talk today. And so today we're going to really be focusing on, how we can make a difference in the world of resident engagement. And so the objectives today, we're going to talk, number 1, outline the current state of resident engagement in senior living communities. 2, we're going to understand both the challenges and opportunities that senior living organizations have when it comes to resident engagement. And then lastly, and more importantly, we're going to talk about how to apply some evidence-based practices using some proven benchmarks to improve the culture in your community when it comes to person-centered resident engagement. So let's get started. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what is the state of resident engagement. And the areas I'm going to cover are not necessarily new for us. I think we're all aware of the challenges, but what I did was I pulled some data from the last year from various surveys that Link Senior does when they're providing CE presentations. We do a post survey with individuals like yourself, and thank you so much for all of your participation in those because they're extremely helpful. I pulled some information that I thought would be interesting to kind of paint the picture of what resident engagement looks like today. So when we talk about how we deliver activities and how we track activity participation, it was interesting that of the surveys that we put out, 58% of individuals or organizations track participation via paper, 24% use a computer program, and 18% do not track participation. Now, part of the not tracking participation could very well be due to regulation. It's not required, usually in assisted living facilities. And so some may choose to track just out of a sheer notion of to understand their population, and some may not do that because it's not required. So 18% is not necessarily because people aren't choosing to do it necessarily. It may not be a regulatory standard for them, and therefore it's not something that they would like to implement. But that was interesting that we still have a lot of individuals tracking on paper. And so when I was working more closely and intimately in long-term care and overseeing a wonderful group of activity professionals and rec therapists, you know, I always thought, you know, because we had tracked on paper as well initially, and I always had thought, how do we make that data come alive? How is it possible for individuals to memorize all of the residents' preferences and, you know, what they like and dislike, and then from there develop their goals? How do you pull it off the paper and make it all come alive? So that's a challenge when we are tracking still on paper. So the next point, 72%, when you think about functioning level, right? Functioning level is something that more and more CMS is focusing on when it comes to regulatory standard in long-term care. It may not be a huge focus in assisted living, but individuals still look at that, right? So when you look at functioning level, 72% configure functioning level, but it's not standardized of how we're doing it because there's no one saying this is how you should evaluate functioning level, right? So 21% of the organizations that answered the survey use cognitive scores alone to determine functioning level, low, moderate, high. 43% use cognitive and physical function scores, and 8% use another method. So you can see that this is kind of all over the board in terms of how we as a profession evaluate cognitive functioning. So I thought that was interesting, or functioning level, excuse me. 25% of communities track minutes of participation. So that's a very low number. So when we talk about how much do our residents get per day or how much do they get per month, only 25% track minutes, which is interesting. And then when we get to staffing, because I know that's a huge concern for our activity professionals, 72% say that staffing concerns are the reason why they cannot engage all their residents. Understandable. 32% said it's because of resources and tools. And so 32%, you know, it's getting up there when we think about what are some of the challenges that we have and how can we rectify these challenges. Now, I wanted to take a further look at activities under the lens through the pandemic, because we know this has really put a huge marker on us in terms of how much engagement, how important it is for our residents. So we pulled some interesting information that we wanted to share with you. Now, this is a sample of communities that we have at Link Senior here. And we looked at 4 distinct areas. The first one was numbers of programs offered, and this would be a combination of one-on-ones and groups. And so when you think about, look at the pre-pandemic numbers, right? There were about 370 programs a month offered, but then post-pandemic is higher at 392 programs per month. So you can see where the arrows are. We had our larger waves of the pandemic or COVID, right, around March. And of course, it lasted a couple of months. Then it was around summertime. And then it was around October going into the holidays, right? So with that said, you can kind of see just the drastic drops there of programs being able to be offered, right? And what we know about this is why they dropped is because we know many of you were pulled in 5 million different directions to do things outside of your job description, and you're willing to do that to help with the crisis that everyone was going through. And so you could see that we, you know, obviously offered less programs during those times. But what's interesting is now we're post-pandemic, or we're getting there, right? And we're actually offering about 106% more than we were before, which is wonderful. When we look at one-on-ones, which is interesting here is, of course, around that time, March, right, you can see the blue going up of number of one-on-ones offered. And, you know, there were waves where it went down a little bit and then it went back up again, you know, around the summertime. It kind of took a little bit of a dip, you know, because we thought we were recovering, but then we had the third wave again, October, November, December, the one-on-ones go up again, right? Because we're offering less groups or no groups at all. But if you look at this, through the pandemic, we have increased our one-on-ones by 326%, which is great. Now, of course, that's a little bit skewed, right? Because we do know that we, you know, many of you didn't offer groups because you weren't allowed to. and one-on-ones was your main source, unless you had individuals who could be independent. So with that said, we would expect to see this large increase, but what's wonderful, if you look at May, we are still offering more one-on-ones now than we did, of course, pre-pandemic, which is great. Because what we're noticing is, let me just go back for a second. What we're noticing is that when you talk to residents about this more attention that they're getting, many of them absolutely love this more intimate one-on-one attention that they're getting. And so, hopefully maybe this is a new era for more increased one-on-ones, or for the understanding of importance of one-on-ones, as we kind of start to clear up from the pandemic, if you will. The third area is looking at minutes per resident per day. So for our communities that do track minutes, we were able to gather some information. Here you go. First wave, you see a drastic decrease in the number of minutes that were being offered, which is understandable, right? Because when we can't offer groups anymore, and it's just one-on-one time, of course it's going to be less time because we don't have a lot of staff, right? But you can see that drastic drop there in the first wave, and then you see more of a kind of a continuous drop from August all the way through the holidays. And then, of course, we are still at a decrease right now, 54% decrease after or post-pandemic, if you will, right? So we are able to still offer as many minutes per day per resident, unfortunately, because we're still trying to recover, and many of you probably are taking care of other still job responsibilities to help fill in gaps for staffing issues due to still the recovery of the pandemic, if you will. So, this is an area where we can see it's a challenge. Now, this was really interesting that we found. This is on the residents, who are declining activities, right? So our pre-pandemic rate was 10%, right? You can notice in the arrows, the gray is the decline data, and you can see that residents during the waves actually decline less. So meaning that they refused less of their programs when they had less offered to them. So it was kind of those, beggars can't be choosers, and so they're willing to be engaged and not decline those activities when offered. And so you can see, around, again, March, April, May, the gray starts to decrease, means they're declining less. Then you start to see it again in the summertime, and then even more so around the holidays again with that third wave. Now, the interesting thing is we are actually at a higher decline rate now, post-pandemic, if you will, again, than the pre-pandemic. So it's good in the fact that residents are making their preferences known. So maybe they decide, I don't want to do that. The other thing is maybe because if we are offering more groups, then of course we were through the pandemic, maybe residents are looking for that one-on-one time more than the group time. So these are just things that we can assume from the data, but just thought it'd be really interesting to show you just a highlight of what the pandemic has unfortunately impacted activities, but now we're able to recreate, right, what this new era might look like for us. So let's just review those challenges. We know, from the first slide that I showed you, there's really no benchmarks. There's no trend analyses. We kind of take what we know from the guidance from our regulation, if we have regulation, or from our job description, and we say, okay, this is what I think we should be doing to measure our residents, right? Whether it's functioning level, whether it's how many minutes, is a quality, time with our residents. What does that look like? There's really no consistency there, right? And so, unfortunately, what that looks like to our operators and our C-suite individuals is that, we've heard this before, activities is nice to have, it's fun, right? But it's not really viewed as necessary, right? Outside of like regulatory requirements or it's not necessarily health impacting, because there's no data to prove that. So it's unfortunately not being measured, and therefore it's not seen as a return on investment for a lot of our operators. Post-pandemic, more programs are being offered, likely groups, with the assumption of trying to get back to normal, but there is an increase in declines and less engagement. So are residents wanting more one-on-one time? But I know we struggle with staffing. So how is that going to be possible? Then most operators, both large and small, are struggling financially to make ends meet. We get that. So there's budget cuts. And who's one of the first departments to get budget cuts? Usually it's life enrichment departments. leaving little room for staffing and resources. And that was kind of what the data had showed, that about 32% of communities, their second pain point is that they don't have enough resources and tools next to staffing, right? So it's a challenge overall. However, where are opportunities? Number one, together, let's redefine and create a new era of resident engagement. This is the time to do it post-pandemic as we're recovering and getting back on our feet, right? Let's start to create these benchmarks and standards together that's derived from empirical research and clinical expertise, right? So let's move from activities being nice to have or fun to it's clinically necessary. You know, this is needed in order for better clinical outcomes. It's needed for an improvement census, to have longer lengths of stay, right? And I can go on, and we'll get to those here in a few slides, but let's show that activities does have a return on investment, and that's what's important. Let's look at how we can improve clinical and quality outcomes. I just heard the last session, you know, an operator talking about social prescription, right? When we can prescribe what the activity plan should look like based on empirical research and data, and say, if you engage your residents, you know, in this way for this many minutes with this quality, right? This is what can happen for this resident. You know, they may have less falls, less use of psychotropic medication, right? Maybe they have a longer length of stay, or they'll have little to no return to hospitalizations, right? These are all your hot button return on investment items that we need to pinpoint to say, because we're engaging more, this is, look at all your good clinical and quality outcomes. So let's prove the need for resident engagement, lending staff to staff retention and potentially an increase in the staff, right? Because if we are showing in activities that there's a return on investment, that leaves room for you to have more staff, a more investment on your resources and tools, right? So this is something where we can do it together. So Link Senior, I am their product program director, and this is something where we are really looking to partner with you on a new version of Link Senior's platform. So as you know, our mission is to provide a platform to engage residents in a way that provides them the highest quality of life. This is accomplished by improving to the care provided, right? And quality care is possible by running a smarter business. So we are going to introduce to you what's called the API process. It's a familiar but underutilized process in the activity rec world, and we want to be able to help implement this process, which is a standardized process for you so you can run a smarter business. Now let's talk about what a smarter business looks like, right? When staff duties are handled efficiently with protocols and time management, when we are proving that we have effective treatment measured by clinical outcomes, when we have exemplar satisfaction surveys, when we have good census management, when we have good staff retention, these can help define your return on investment. So that's running a smarter business. So I'm going to go through with you quickly what is the API process, and then I'll go through an example with you about how can our new version that we're going to be launching to you. We're going to be launching this version to be able to facilitate the API process, so that way you can provide the treatment to your residents more efficiently and more effectively, right? So API stands for assess, plan, implement, evaluate, right? It's a standard practice model. This is nothing new. Again, familiar, but underutilized in our activity rec world, right? It allows for a structured treatment process to take place. And so what we'll be doing is the API process within the Link Senior platform will provide the standard of practice for you to be more efficient and effective, and this makes for a smarter business. So let's talk about assess. When we assess a resident, there's several goals that we're trying to achieve here, right? We're asking questions to provide the assessor or yourself as the activity professional pertinent information, right? That help you understand the resident better, right? What are they challenged with? What's their symptomology? It helps to gather and better understand their needs and preferences. It's an opportunity for the assessor to get to know and understand the resident, right? It allows you to be able to define what the strengths are of the resident and what's worked in the past and what hasn't worked, right? That's the goal when we assess a resident. So what we hope to do, right, is to have custom information that we can build out for you that will help define some key metrics to measure. And so with that said, within the Link Senior platform, we hope to do that for you. The result is that from that assessment, we can then develop a plan of care, so essentially the system will be able to, at some point, be able to determine functioning level for you with a standard practice model and develop a prescriptive plan, right? The social prescription that we talked about. So the platform will be able to take custom information, custom assessments, and then create, and tell you what is the functioning level, and from there be able to create that social prescription plan that's needed. So without further ado, Katie's going to go in and talk a little bit about preferences and why do preferences matter from that assessment process. Katie?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm just delighted to be here. And I'm looking over here at the chat box. I'm trying to follow the chat as I'm listening. And it's just so fantastic to hear you all. And Monette just wrote in the chat that my challenges is I have a lot of fun activities, but very few residents join. So how can you change that? And one major recommendation that we have is to understand what your residents prefer to do. Right? And so think about your own preferences. So for example, just think about your morning routine. Do you like to have coffee or tea? So in my house, I have to get up early and walk our pandemically adopted puppy so she doesn't wake everybody else up. And when I do that, our day starts off on the right foot. And so similarly, honoring resident preferences for daily living fosters engagement and quality of life. When we have a voice in how we want to live, we can act based on our own values and interests or autonomy. So think about a time for when someone gave you the perfect gift. How did that make you feel? Right? I would imagine that you felt known and respected by this person who took the time to get this gift for you. This is true when we are able to honor the preferences for residents too, which also help to build relationships based on trust. So Jennifer, if you'll go to the next slide, please. So why do preferences matter to care team members? Well, if you know what people prefer, you can feel proud that you're delivering the type of care that is meaningful to them. Families will see that you have taken the time to learn about the residents' likes and dislikes, which will help form strong partnerships with care team members who can anticipate needs. This allows care team members to be more efficient because they are directing their time to what matters most to the individual receiving care. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so finally, why do preferences matter to your community? Well, we know that you'll have better quality outcomes because you will likely pick up on subtle changes that are precursors to underlying issues, such as urinary tract infections. So if someone suddenly stops attending a preferred activity, you will know it's time to check in and see what's going on with that individual. You're likely to also see more referrals from people who have had good experiences in your community. And lastly, care team members are not going to experience this idea of moral distress. So that feeling you get when you're unable to deliver the kind of care you want and know that you should be able to deliver. And so that helps increase staff retention when you're not put in that moral distress position. And let's go to the next slide, please. So we know that there are many barriers to providing person-centered care, including the time needed for preference assessments and ways of communicating important preferences across departments and shifts. We also know that if you don't measure what you treasure, you can't improve. And this is one of the major takeaways of this session is, do you measure what you treasure or treasure what you measure? So we've developed in partnership with Link Senior a software that assists you, the provider, in delivering preference-based person-centered care. The primary aim of using Compass 16 is to support planning and delivery of individualized care that meets each person's psychosocial and physical needs. Compass can also be used to accelerate quality improvement and align services more closely with expectations for consumers, families, and regulatory agencies. And Compass supports care providers in enhancing person-centered care by providing a streamlined preference interview with key follow-up questions for important preferences. So for example, it's great to know that it's important for them to be around animals such as pets, but you need to know if they're terrified of dogs and prefer bunnies, or if they're allergic to cats and prefer snakes. We've actually had a resident that preferred snakes. Isn't that interesting? We also have a PAL card generator to help communicate across departments and shifts. And if you're not familiar with the PAL cards, I'll put some links in the chat when I'm done that will give you some more information. Compass also supports the process of asking satisfaction questions to understand if individuals are satisfied with the way their important preferences are being fulfilled. It produces easy to understand visual reports to track satisfaction over time at the individual, neighborhood, and community level. And so it can roll up to give you more information. And that will help you target your very scarce resources to get the biggest bang for your buck. And finally, you can use Compass to meet your regulatory person-centered care mandates. And if you're interested in using Compass, you can access the software at the following link. And again, I'll drop these links into the chat as soon as I'm done here. We also provide regular demos, and you can find out about those on our website at preference-based-living.com. So let me turn it back to Jennifer, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Katie, so much. And so, as Katie went through the Compass 16, this is an example of what can be used to gather the information you need for your resident with regards to preference. And then the new platform that we'll be launching to you will be able to take that information and, with amongst some other important assessment information, be able to develop and look at what is that level of functioning for that resident. And then from there, create a social prescription plan based on what you should be providing to the resident, what kinds of programs, as well as, making sure it's preference-based. So how wonderful is that it can do it all for you, and you don't even need to really compute it yourself or think about it yourself. You will be able to have this done for you through this new platform that we're really excited to launch to you. So the second part after assessment, right, is the plan. So now, when we plan something, we want to take that assessment information again and determine that prescription or that recommendation for that engagement plan that will meet the goals, that will assist the resident, with their symptomology and their challenges. It will help provide programming to meet their needs and preferences in a meaningful way, and it will ensure their needs and preferences are being upheld. So how will this happen? Again, the functioning level will be configured for you in this new platform, and then the social prescription plan will be recommended, right? So for example, it'll say, engage Gus for 35 minutes per day with groups and independent activities, and then it will be able to provide that preference type information. So he likes fishing, so it will recommend that you create the themes of his activities around fishing. So the result here is that this will help you as the customer plan out how long the resident should be engaged each day based on what's recommended in empirical research. Which programs will be most beneficial to the resident? Is it groups? Is it one-on-ones? Is it independent activities? Is it a combination? What type of group and one-on-ones would benefit them, meaning based on their preference? And it can help group these residents in the, who have the same interests. So not only are you being able to use the new platform to look at person-centered individual care, but also from a community perspective, it'll be able to tell you which residents have the same interests, right? So how wonderful is that? We are also looking at the new platform being able to say to you, okay, if you have all these residents that have these plans, how many staff do you need to make this possible, right? So a part of the program will be able to develop this for you and show you how many staff you might need as well. Then we get to the implement, right? So now you're going to provide this social prescription plan. So this is where we deliver the programs outlined. How this is going to happen, the customer will be able to then use our engagement programming and interventions that's offered through the links in your platform. And so some of you may be familiar with our programs that we offer, both that's built into the system, but there's also what's called Salo Live, where we have live entertainment as well. There's some other wonderful things that we're going to have in there, from the Activity Strong program library, which many of you already are aware of, where you can pull information as well. So there's a lot of good information that you can bring into to deliver your programs. So the result is that this allows resident data to be at the customer's fingertips, right? Because you're tracking participation during this time as you're implementing the program that's recommended. So you can see right away, are we on track with the resident's goals that relates to the prescription plan that's recommended, right? And it can allow engagement to go beyond the activity staff, which is very important. And it can also be used in personal care, therapy, family visits, and more, right? When you have, the ability to use this platform, really anybody can use it, right? It doesn't have to be just an activity professional. It could be a CNA. It could be a family member, right? And when we talk about activities, it should be provided by anybody at any time. And so with the new platform that we're going to launch, we hope that more people want to use it, making staff time with the resident a little bit easier because they're able to provide this kind of programming, right? And so this also will help the customer yourselves be able to look at the data for compliance and regulatory standards as well. So this is going to be really important information if you get surveyed by public health. You have that information right at your fingertips. So, which residents of mine are low, moderate, high functioning. If you have to print off lists quickly, you'll be able to look at individual data to see if they're in compliance with the benchmark set, and also be able to look at how that's impacting your clinical outcomes. So then we get to evaluate, right? So this is where we reevaluate the resident to see if their challenge and symptoms have been reduced, if their needs have been met, if their preferences are, if we are really providing meaningful engagement, right? So we can compare past data to current data. We can see if those goals have been met based on that social prescription plan that's recommended through the system will be able to compute that for you, and then be able to ensure that this prescription or recommendation that's being followed is working for that resident, right? We can review what's not working and then adjust the plan accordingly. So how wonderful is that to have a system that does that all for you? So let me get into the how for the evaluate, So customers can see the data at a snapshot and see if goals have been met, and then they can run more in-depth reports to see trends and patterns, right? So the result is that you'll be able to have real-time information about the residents' individuals' goals compared to the residents, compared to the community goals, You'll be able to look at participation percentage, most attended programs and what type of programs, how are we progressing in clinical areas? So the new dashboard will be able to show you, how are we doing with falls? How are we doing with psychotropic medications and so on? And satisfaction, how satisfied are our residents and how satisfied are our staff, which is very important, right? So you'll be able to run these reports and share this information with staff, families, and government agencies. And additionally, if you're in a corporate role, you'll be able to look at communities and their progress as a whole or by region or by level of care based on how you want to be able to see that information. So when we talk about these various kinds of platforms within Link Senior, this gives you a nice summary of the API process. So in the assess component, who are your residents and what are their needs, you'll be able to use with this new platform, SALO context, Compass 16, and any customized assessments that we can take a look at for you. In the plan component, we're going to give each resident a social prescription plan, right, that meets their needs. So with that, we'll be using information from SALO context, Activity Strong Program Library, and the Compass preferences as well. Then you want to implement the plan, and you want to be able to track the participation, right? And so you'll be able to do this through SALO Context, SALO Engage, and the Compass PAL cards. And lastly, we're going to reevaluate the resident to see, is our social prescription plan, is it working, right? And so from there, we'll be able to take information from SALO Context and Compass to be able to see how our residents are doing, as well as how our community is doing, and communities across organizations. So with the measurements, we want to, of course, we talked about benchmarks and creating these benchmarks so that way we know how, what we should be shooting for, right? So there's a few benchmarks that we're taking a look at, and we really want your recommendations for this because, for us, we're taking our expertise, right? A combination of expertise from various individuals in the field. And, in the beginning, we might get it all wrong when we do this. And so it's so important that we get your information, your preference on what you want to see as well, right? So, but there are a few areas of measurements of success that we want to start with, right? Is let's look at how many minutes per resident per day, and I'll go into this a little further. What is going to be that set number for that resident that we want to shoot for on a daily basis, right? So this really is person-centered focus based on individualized needs, right? It's not necessarily community-focused goals. I mean, you can have those, but this is more driving it down to the resident. So when you define MRD, it sets a benchmark of how much each resident should be engaged that's shown in clinical research to be effective for healthy aging. So I'll go in a little bit more into that in a second. The second measurement of success is preference-based care. So are we providing quality activities? Because you can engage a resident for 30 minutes, but if it's not of quality, then it's meaningless, right? So it's really important that we are providing that meaningful engagement, right? The third benchmark is clinical outcomes. So as MRD is being achieved, do we see improvement in clinical outcomes? So, examples would be reduction in falls, stabilization or improvement in cognitive and functional status, reduction in psychotropic medication, right? Improvement in depression scores, increase in index of social engagement, lower rates of RTH, right? Or a longer length of stay, right? Depending on what your community is in long-term care. The fourth area is census, right? So do we see an increase in census that is derived an increase in revenue, right? So if we have longer lengths of stay or we have less return to hospitalizations, you're going to have a more stabilized census, right? And that's going to drive more revenue to the business. And lastly, another measurement of success is staff retention, right? So as API is delivered through the Link Senior platform and staff are realizing that this platform makes their lives easier, right? They have a more efficient, effective process of delivering treatment for our residents. They will inevitably feel more confident, more competent, effective, and efficient at their jobs, resulting in staff retention, which is important, right? So we propose these 5 measurements of success for you to start creating benchmarks for what we do, because what we do is extremely important, and it can, and we all know that it helps our residents both from a social and a medical and a cognitive and a spiritual, right? In all these areas, when we talk about holistic care, right? We know this is impacting our residents. So it's important that we prove it through data and measuring, benchmarks that we have. I want to talk a little bit more about MRD, a little bit of what we're proposing for MRD to get started, and we are very open to feedback with this. What I did was I looked at pre-pandemic, because it wouldn't be fair during the pandemic to look at how many minutes we're providing, per resident. So we looked at a combination of Link Senior communities, some of our kind of 5-star communities that are doing really well. We took a combination of their data and showed that on average, they're engaging their residents about 35 minutes a day. So 35 minutes per resident per day. Then I pulled some information. Some of you might be familiar with our RICE study that we have done, and we're actually in talks, and we're doing a second version, which we're excited about. But the RICE study is providing quality information that is reported by staff and community members. So it's all self-report, so it's a little bit higher than what we saw when we pulled the Link Senior data. And so they're saying that they approximately 45 minutes per resident per day, they engage their residents, right? And then I looked at clinical research, what's been found beneficial for our aging seniors and how to keep them the most healthy. And when you look at the research on physical and cognitive activities or engagement, the recommendation is around 30 minutes a day, right? So when we look at a kind of a combination or average of these, right, these 3 areas, it comes out to about 36.70 minutes per day. Obviously, to make our lives easier, we're going to estimate around 35 minutes per resident per day should be the optimal number of minutes to engage a resident on a regular basis. Now, let's get to my next slide here, and we talk about how to scale this, because functioning level is very important when it comes to this, because we do know if we have a very low functioning individual who has dementia, there's no way we can necessarily engage them for 35 minutes. And so with that said, we would take into account, this is where the social prescription plan comes in, where Link Senior will take that assessment information, they will compute the level of functioning for you, and then they will recommend that social prescription plan, right? So for example, residents who fall on the high level will be recommended at 35 minutes a day for group and independent activities. Now, and then you can kind of see how it's scaled down from there. The important part to know here is that your clinical expertise is extremely important. And so you may say, maybe my resident doesn't like to do groups, although they are very high functioning, they just want to do independent activities. Sure, we'll invite, we'll encourage, but maybe their plan, you can tailor it to just be independent, because obviously you're there with your resident, you know what the resident wants. So these will be able to be tailored based on what you know about the resident, but this is just what we're recommending, and you can alter it from there. Now, what's important is that we have quality minutes, right? So the preference is what comes in as well. So that social prescription plan will include those preferences. So I want to go through an example and walk through the API process for you and what it would look like in our system when we launch this new version for you. So Joy, we're going to call our patient Joy, an 85-year-old female resident with advanced dementia in skilled nursing, okay? So Joy is assessed by her treatment team using the MDS 3.0 section F, and then they also use the COMPASS preferences of what Katie was talking about. And we're going to pull some information also from SALO context, which look at demographics and diagnoses, right? And then they're going to recommend a plan from there, right? So the information that we see based on the assessment, she has dementia, she's English speaking, Caucasian, Catholic female, she loves cooking and baking, sewing, and cats. She's low functioning because the system was able to compute that for the customer. And her communication style is she has some repetitive behaviors of yelling out. Now, the plan, the social prescription plan, will use a number of areas from the platforms to be able to create that plan. So they're going to use the Activity Strong library, COMPASS preferences. We have some dementia cue cards as well. And that will help provide the plan to engage and improve her quality of life. So the prescription plan that's recommended is that she be engaged in one-on-ones 2 times daily at 3 to 4 minute intervals with a focus on tactile stimulation, utilizing cooking, baking, sewing, pet therapy, and spiritual activities as tolerated. Then from there, the team's going to implement the program and track Joy's participation level, right? So through this, you'll be able to use SALO context, SALO engage, the COMPASS PAL cards, and the dementia cue cards to be able to do this. So they're tracking the engagement on one-on-one, both through the programs that I had mentioned, and they're also using dementia cue cards to help with how to intervene appropriately when she is communicating the way she communicates through yelling out. Then we can be able to evaluate how did this social prescription plan work. So if we're meeting the social prescription plan, what are some of our outcomes, right? And so from here, the customer will be able to use SALO context, which will have the MRD on the dashboard, and then the scorecard, which will look at participation level and some of these key areas I'm going to go over in a second, right? And so if you look at Joy's progress, so her MRD is being met 90% of the time, which is a great score, and her average participation is at 85%. I would say that's pretty good, right? Joy's family and staff rate high on their COMPASS customer satisfaction survey, which we'll be working with COMPASS on building. Joy's yelling out communication style has decreased by 60%, and her psychotropic use has decreased by 70%. So when we talk about PRN use that the staff were using previous to, in this example, previous to using Link Senior, they were able to decrease her psychotropic use by 70%. Her cognitive and physical function scores have stabilized, so she's not declined any further since the first assessment. And her depression score is now at 0, so it was higher and they reduced it to 100%. Her index of social engagement score was raised by 1 level, which is great, meaning she is wanting to be engaged more. Her fall rate was decreased by 90%, and she had only 1 hospitalization in the last 90 days, which is a reduction of 90%. And so we would say that her social prescription plan, if the staff are meeting it, which they are, it is working for her because she has outstanding numbers when it comes to her clinical and quality outcomes. We also can look at the staff that work with Joy, right? And be able to assess their, engagement. So basically, when we look at Joy's regular caregivers are provided a satisfaction survey. We measure, and these are just proposals, right? We're not saying this is exactly what we're going to measure, but we're hoping to do this. How competent do they feel? How confident do they feel? How effective and how efficient? And then there's an overall score. So again, staff are rating at anywhere from a 97% to a 89% satisfaction. The overall average is 93.25% satisfied, which we would say is a pretty good score for our staff, right? When we look at how satisfied they are in working with Joy. So with that said, I hope that example was helpful at kind of painting a picture of where we're going with our new platform. And the idea is using the API process within the Link Senior program will allow the customer to focus on quality care in a more efficient manner, right? So in summary, the data from the built-in assessments help create the plan. The plan is then carried out by the customer, implemented and tracked. After implementing the plan, the customer can evaluate using the data produced from the tracking. And from there, the customers can adjust the plan. So the customer can do more in a shorter amount of time. That's a smarter business model. So in conclusion, the API process is a standard practice model, right? It's a familiar yet a underutilized standard practice model in activities, right? In resident engagement. So we've been able to capture this process within the new Link Senior platform, which will allow customers to be more efficient and effective with providing quality treatment, right? You'll be able to take the information, or the platform will be able to take the information, create these wonderful steps for you and walk you through the process. You'll be able to print off beautiful reports with summary data information that is right at your fingertips. So that way you can do more with less time essentially, right? So this lends to a smarter business model. So with that said, we certainly want to open it up for questions. But before we do that, we want to be able to introduce to you a new institute that Charles, the CEO, and his team and I have created called the Resident Engagement Institute. And what we hope to do with this is, when we talk about the API process and we talk about being able to create this kind of new era of resident engagement, we want to be able to support this through what we're calling the Resident Engagement Institute, right? So the vision of this is that we want to be able to make social prescription the standard for senior living and resident engagement, right? We hope to empower individuals like yourself to partner with us, and we want to provide education and tools and support to elevate resident engagement for all elders. So the objective here is we want to define a new era in resident engagement by establishing tools and the benchmarks that I mentioned and the strategies, right, that are implementable for senior living operators and for the staff that we engage with residents every day. The work of the Institute will be measurable and quantifiable, which is new for us, again, here in senior living for activities. And it's going to be based on satisfaction, health, and well-being outcomes. It'll be rooted in research. And so we want to be able to provide that exclusive data sets to you from our published studies that we'll be doing. We're going to have a faculty of experts in the field that will also be using any data that they're producing, as well as
I think we lost Jennifer. Oh, that's unfortunate.
Can you hear me still?
Yes, we can. We can still hear you. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, it looks like my internet went out. So, so with that said, I can just finish up as I'm reconnecting. So I apologize.
Okay.
We want to be able to offer these benchmarks and standards for you guys. The faculty, we're going to be using some of their research and be able to provide that to you, as well as your initiatives, as we want to be able to partner together with you in this new era and invite you to the Resident Engagement Institute for all of our customers. So with that, I want to be able to open it up for questions. And Charles, if you can read off the questions, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. No problem at all. Jennifer, thank you so much for this awesome presentation. Katie, I know that you and Jennifer worked very closely on this. Thank you so much for assisting us and all of the fantastic work that you've been doing with Compass, Pelly, and our partnership here. I think obviously there's a lot of questions. So unfortunately, just in the amount of time here, what I'd love to maybe ask Katie is, I think that some people are aware of Compass and some people might not be. But if you, the question that we often get, and you and I talk about that often, is, MDS is something that we all have to do in the nursing home setting. And often doing more, we might not be reimbursed, we might not be paid, and so on. what have you seen to be successful for organizations to say, okay, yeah, we'll do it all? What has been the aha moment, whether it's the administrator at the building level or maybe somebody at a corporate level?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what I can do is illustrate with the pandemic. So the organizations and communities that we were working with, when they were taking the time to, and somebody mentioned this in the chat, that it takes time to do these assessments. And if you're able to communicate how those assessments can help build relationships and trust, if you can have your leadership support that, which of course you have to have in order to do this work, then when these communities had to shift to one-on-one engagement, it was seamless. They knew exactly what the individual wanted to do. We had some communities that made little tote bags, and they put preferred things in that for that individual in a tote bag that stayed with that individual in that room, so they could use it. They knew the CD player and the music that the individual wanted to listen to, or they wanted a Sudoku puzzle, and that was there for them. They created, they had PAL cards created so that when staff weren't allowed into, maybe somebody was moved to a COVID unit and they weren't allowed in, whoever was able to go in to provide care could quickly learn about that individual and find some commonalities. And so I think fundamentally, it's a philosophical choice about what do we value, what do we treasure. And if we want to provide high quality care about and what matters most to individuals, we must know what's important to them.
Yeah, and something that I'm hearing between your words also, Katie, is that the organization, and we see that obviously with our work with you and beyond that also, is people that have committed to these things prior to the pandemic are probably the people that fared the better, right? They had more tools, they had a better understanding of the elders they served. They actually sometimes, very often, had a better understanding even of their staff. And so they had more structure to fight, obviously, the unfortunate aspect of this pandemic, which is the social isolation and so on. Jennifer, are you still on the line here? I have a question for you.
I am. Unfortunately, I cannot come.
It's fine.
I cannot.
No, I do have a question for you, which is, a lot of what we talk about is measurement, is establishing benchmarks, and we are all firm believers that unless it gets measured, it doesn't get managed, right? So we need to measure to manage. Often a typical organization is going to say, well, we track attendance because it's a requirement, it's compliance, it's only for skilled, and we're maybe skilled, but if we're not interested in that. You have years of experience, Jennifer, serving in the building, and actually you started at a corporate role as well. But what would be the one thing you would tell providers out there right now listening to us about? You need to go beyond compliance. It doesn't matter which level of care you are, do it. What would be the one reason you would drive them to do this?
I would probably say that, at the end of the day, when you look at the quality of what we provide to our residents, that is where the focus really needs to be. We want to ensure that our residents are provided that quality time, because when you take a look at, just what human interaction does for, all parts of self, when you look at what it does for individuals' cognition, what it looks for their physical health, their spirituality, their emotional and mental health, right? And in all facets, right? What it does for us, quality is extremely important. And so, although, with the varying levels of care that people offer, I know in assisted living, the regulatory requirements are very easy, if you will. When you get down to the skilled level, of course, very strict regulation. But regardless of regulation, we should be providing the quality of care as best as possible. Now, we know it's extremely hard because, as I mentioned when we first started, that the first area usually when we look at budget cuts because of financial issues is in the activities department, whether it's staffing or whether it's lack of resources and tools. That's hard to provide quality all the time. And so what we need to look at, though, is if we can prove, again, that quality interaction really does help with the clinical and quality outcomes of the business, the organization. And we can show that there, the engagement, resident engagement, there is a return on investment there. When you go to ask your administrator, your executive director, or maybe your corporate person about getting more staff or more an increase in budget for your supplies, when you have this data, you can then prove that it is a return on investment for them, and that the more that they invest in activities, the more they're investing in the residents' quality of life. And that's extremely important, so take out regulation, take out, kind of these, public health surveyors that, surveys that everyone's always so worried about, which they should be, and just look at the person in front of you, that resident, to say, how can I provide them the best quality? Let me show that what I'm doing is 100% a return on investment on a daily basis. Let me show it and prove it to the people that are making the decisions around finances, so that way I can provide more and more care. So I would say the biggest focus is, with regulation and those kinds of things, that shouldn't be your standard of practice. It should be based on, what we know, what will work for aging seniors, based on empirical evidence, and what we know what human touch can do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this, Jennifer. And I'd love to maybe loop back and just finish, because we're out of time, unfortunately. Everything you just said obviously makes sense, Jennifer, and I believe, we all believe that you're 100% right. Beyond this, it's also what Katie was sharing with, which is it's a philosophical question we need to ask ourselves, right? Our staff want this, and our residents and our elders deserve it. So ultimately, I think that's a great way to, thank you for the thumbs up, Katie. It's a great way to sum up this conversation. Katie and Jennifer, as always, thank you for the fantastic work that you've been doing. It's a pleasure to work with you. I just want to say also how thankful I am for you both working together and presenting as part of our Activity Strong Summit. This is the future, there's no question about it. All of our sessions today have talked about this ideal social prescription. So the question isn't, if we're going to get there, the question is when. And with that, I want to thank you, Katie, and thank Jennifer for helping us lead the charge here. I will wish you a wonderful afternoon. Please feel free to stay on. Jennifer, if you can get back on, feel free to do this. Katie, if you don't mind taking your video off so we can get to the next session. I want to thank you again for your time today, both Katie and Jennifer.
Thank you.